Christopher Montgomery stood in the doorway of his wedding night, jaw clenched with bitter resentment. This marriage wasn't love, it was business, a calculated merger disguised as sacred vows. Grace Whitmore, his new wife, waited behind that bedroom door, and he intended to make one thing crystal clear. She meant nothing to him. He would take what was his by contract and leave her with no illusions about affection. But what happened next? No one there could have imagined. Is there anything more dangerous than a wounded man who finally finds a woman capable of healing his scars, but refuses to let her into his heart? If this story touches your heart and sparks your imagination, subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And if every moment was worth it, drop a totally worth it. The Montgomery mansion rose imposingly against Connecticut's starlit sky, its illuminated windows creating a cruel contrast with the coldness that hung within its stone walls. Christopher Montgomery adjusted his white shirt cuff, his fingers trembling not from nervousness, but from a contained rage that boiled in his veins like poison. The wedding had ended a few hours ago, a cold and calculated ceremony where forced smiles masked the brutal reality. This was nothing more than a commercial transaction disguised as a sacred union. The scent of white roses still clung to his dark hair, a sweet perfume that now made him nauseous. Each step toward the bridal chamber echoed through the marble corridor like a death sentence, the sound of his Italian shoes against the cold floor creating a sinister rhythm that accompanied his racing heartbeat. He had been forced into this, forced by his father, Harold Montgomery, whose financial empire was at stake, forced by circumstances that turned Grace Whitmore, daughter of a bankrupt businessman, into the solution to all the family's problems. "She's nothing but a gold digger," he muttered to himself, repeating the words he had used as a shield all day. A schemer who set this whole thing up with her father. The bedroom door stood before him, heavy as the responsibility he now carried on his shoulders. Christopher took a deep breath, feeling the mansion's cold air fill his lungs while his hands clenched into fists. He would enter there not as a loving husband, but as a conqueror determined to show who really ruled this marriage charade. When he turned the golden handle, the metallic sound cut through the silence like a blade. Grace stood by the window, still wearing the wedding dress that cost more than many people earned in a year. The silvery moonlight streamed through the silk fabric, creating an ethereal halo around her delicate silhouette. Her chestnut hair fell in soft waves over her bare shoulders, and when she turned to face him, Christopher could see fear shining in her green eyes, like liquid emeralds. "Christopher," her voice was barely a whisper, laden with a vulnerability he refused to recognize as genuine. "No." He cut off her words brutally, closing the door behind him with enough force to make the sound echo through the luxurious suite. "Don't give me that sweet voice. We both know exactly what you are and why you're here." Grace stepped back, her hands trembling as she clutched the dress fabric. I don't understand." "Don't understand." Christopher moved toward her, his blue-gray eyes burning with an intensity that made the air between them vibrate with tension. "You and your father set this whole thing up perfectly, didn't you? A bankrupt businessman with a beautiful daughter, seducing a rich heir to save his own skin." The words left his mouth like stab wounds, each syllable loaded with years of mistrust and disillusionment. He had learned the hard way that people always wanted something from him, his money, his status, his power. And Grace Whitmore would be no different. "That's not true," she whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to be used as bargaining chip. Liar." The word came out like a low growl, loaded with all the bitterness Christopher had carried since adolescence, when he discovered his first girlfriend was only interested in the family's bank account. "You played the damsel in distress role very well. But now that you've got what you wanted, you can drop the act." He kept approaching, and Grace could feel the heat emanating from his body, mixed with the masculine scent of his aftershave, notes of cedar and bergamot that should have been comforting, but now seemed oppressive in the room's charged atmosphere. Every muscle in his body was tense like a rope about to snap, and she could see the pain behind the anger, a pain so deep it made her want to reach out and touch him, even knowing she'd be rejected. "Christopher, please." Her voice broke, revealing a fragility that echoed off the room's walls like the sound of shattering crystal. "Please what?" He was now just inches from her, So close he could smell the soft scent of her perfume, gardenias and vanilla, that cruelly contrasted with the bitterness dominating his thoughts. Please be gentle with the wife I bought. Please pretend this is something more than a business transaction. Grace closed her eyes, trying to contain the tears that threatened to overflow. When she opened them again, Christopher saw something there that completely disarmed him. Not the greed he expected to find, but a sadness so deep it seemed to echo his own loneliness. "I know you don't love me," she said, her voice gaining unexpected strength. "I know this was arranged by our parents, but I hoped maybe we could find a way to make this bearable, a way to be at least respectful toward each other." Christopher laughed, but it was a humorless sound, harsh as broken glass. "Respect? You want my respect after getting everything you wanted through manipulation?" "I never manipulated anyone," Grace exploded, surprising them both with the intensity of her response. Her cheeks flushed, creating a lovely contrast with her skin's paleness, and her eyes blazed with a passion Christopher didn't expect to see. "You think I wanted this? Think I dreamed of being handed over like a consolation prize to save my father's company?" The sincerity in her voice hit him like a punch to the stomach, but he forced himself to maintain his coldness. He couldn't allow himself to believe, not again. "Then why did you accept?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Grace stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her words came out like a confession torn by force. "Because I had no choice. Just like you." The silence that followed was deafening. Christopher could hear his own heartbeat, the muffled sound of distant New Haven traffic, the tick-tock of the antique clock above the fireplace. But more than that, he could feel something shifting in the air between them, a tiny crack in his armor of cynicism. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, but his voice had lost some of its previous conviction. "We're married now, and you're going to fulfill your duties as a wife." Grace grew even paler, if that were possible. "Christopher, take off the dress." The words came out harsher than he intended, loaded with a cruelty he used as a last defense against the vulnerability that threatened to consume him. He saw Grace shudder, saw her hands trembling when she brought her fingers to the zipper at the back of her dress. But then she stopped. Her hands fell to her sides, and she faced him with a courage that surprised him. "I'm a virgin." The three words fell between them like a bomb, exploding all the certainty Christopher had built about who she was. The world seemed to stop for a moment, the air becoming so thick he could barely breathe. "What?" The word came out as a hoarse whisper. "I'm a virgin," Grace repeated, her cheeks burning with shame, but her eyes remaining steady on his. "I've never been with anyone. If you really believe I'm a schemer who set all this up, then you need to explain why a woman interested only in money would keep herself pure until 23. Christopher felt as if the ground had opened beneath his feet. Every prejudice, every assumption he'd made about her began to crumble like a house of cards. Gold diggers didn't remain virgins, not in the society they lived in, where sexual experience was currency. "So you're lying," he said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "Why would I lie about this?" Grace asked, tears finally overflowing and running down her cheeks like liquid diamonds. "Why would I make up something that only makes me look more pathetic in your eyes?" Christopher fell silent, his mind racing to process this information. The anger that had consumed him for hours began giving way to something much more dangerous, doubt. And with doubt came a glimpse of something he had sworn never to feel again: compassion. Grace remained there, vulnerable and emotionally exposed, waiting for his reaction. And for the first time since he had learned her name, Christopher Montgomery wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about everything. The first rays of morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the bridal suite, creating golden patterns that danced across the Persian rug. Christopher had spent the entire night awake, sitting in the leather armchair by the cold fireplace, watching Grace sleep. She was curled up on the far side of the king-size bed, as if even in sleep she tried to make herself invisible. The wedding dress lay abandoned on the floor like a white satin ghost, and she had found a simple cotton nightgown in her suitcase, a stark contrast to the expensive lingerie he expected a fortune hunter would wear. Her revelation of virginity had been like an earthquake to his convictions, cracking the foundation of certainty he had built over the years. As a man who made his fortune analyzing patterns and inconsistencies in financial markets, Christopher couldn't ignore data that didn't fit his theory about Grace Whitmore. Gold diggers didn't remain pure. They didn't sacrifice years of romantic opportunities for a scheme they didn't even know would work. The soft sound of her sighs during sleep had been sweet torture through the dark hours. Every movement of hers, every small moan of discomfort, reminded him that there was a real person beneath all his projections and fears. A person he had hurt deeply with his cruel accusations. Grace stirred in bed, her long lashes fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. Christopher held his breath, watching her orient herself in the luxurious room that was now officially hers too. When her green eyes finally met his, he saw a flash of fear that quickly transformed into resignation, an expression that hit him like a punch to the gut. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice hoarse from sleep and unshed tears. "Good morning." He rose from the armchair, every muscle in his body protesting against the night spent in an uncomfortable position. He had only removed his jacket and tie, his white shirt now wrinkled and open at the collar, revealing a small portion of muscled chest that made Grace quickly look away. An awkward silence settled between them, heavy as the air before a storm. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor, and Christopher noticed how she unconsciously made herself smaller, a reflex of someone accustomed to shrinking to avoid conflict. "I'm going to shower," she murmured, standing and walking toward the marble ensuite attached to the bedroom. Then we can talk about how this is going to work." Christopher watched her disappear behind the frosted glass door, and soon the sound of running water echoed through the room. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the images his mind insisted on creating. Grace under the hot spray of the shower, drops of water sliding down her pale skin like wet rose petals. "Stop," he muttered to himself, running his hands through his dark hair. He couldn't let physical attraction cloud his judgment. Even if she was a virgin, that didn't change the fact that they were both trapped in a marriage neither had truly chosen. When Grace emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, she was dressed in a simple navy dress that brought out her eyes, her damp hair combed back in a low bun that exposed the elegant curve of her neck. Christopher felt his throat go dry. There was something devastatingly beautiful about her simplicity, a natural beauty that didn't need artifice or manipulation to shine. "Christopher," she began, her hands nervously smoothing her dress skirt. "About last night. I understand your anger. I understand why you assume certain things about me. But if we're going to live together, we need to establish some ground rules." He raised an eyebrow, surprised by the strength he detected in her voice. "What kind of rules?" "I won't pretend this is a real marriage," Grace said, lifting her chin in a gesture of determination that impressed him. "But I also won't accept being treated like a criminal in my own home. If you want me to play my role as your wife in public, then in private we need at minimum mutual courtesy." Christopher studied her face, searching for signs of manipulation or falseness. But all he saw was a young woman trying to survive an impossible situation with what remained of her dignity intact. "And what do you suggest?" he asked, surprised to find himself genuinely interested in her answer. "Separate bedrooms," Grace said quickly, her cheeks flushing slightly. "At least until we decide how to proceed. We'll keep up appearances in public, but at home, we're just civilized roommates." "Roommates," Christopher repeated, a ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's an interesting way to describe a marriage." "Do you have a better description?" Grace asked, and for the first time since they'd met, he detected a glimmer of humor in her eyes. Before Christopher could answer, a soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. "Mr. Montgomery?" The warm voice of Margaret Davies, the family's housekeeper for over 20 years, echoed through the heavy wood. "Breakfast is served." "Thank you, Margaret," Christopher replied. "We'll be down shortly." When the housekeeper's footsteps faded away, Grace faced him with a questioning expression. "Margaret seems kind. She's more of a mother to me than—" Christopher stopped abruptly, realizing he was about to reveal more than he intended, but there was something in Grace's understanding eyes that made him want to continue. "My mother died when I was 8. Margaret has raised me since then." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly, and the sincerity in her voice hit him like an unexpected caress. "It must have been very difficult growing up without her. Christopher nodded, a familiar pain settling in his chest. Harold, my father, isn't exactly the nurturing type. He sees relationships as investments, love as a weakness that can be exploited. And that's why you don't believe me, Grace said, and it wasn't a question. That's why I don't believe anyone, Christopher admitted, his voice low and rough. Every relationship I've ever had ended when the person discovered I was worth more as a bank account than as a companion. Grace studied him for a long moment, her green eyes reflecting an understanding that made him uncomfortable. Have you ever considered that maybe you're attracting the wrong kind of person? How so? Well, if you introduce yourself first as Christopher Montgomery, heir to a financial empire, instead of just Christopher, the man, what kind of woman do you think that's going to attract? The question hit him like a slap in the face. She was right, and he knew it. For years he had used his wealth as a test, a way to separate gold diggers from genuine women. But in doing so, he had also hidden behind his fortune, never really allowing himself to be vulnerable enough to find true love. You didn't know who I was when we met, he said slowly, a realization dawning in his mind like sunrise. No, Grace confirmed. I only found out about the arranged marriage 3 days before the ceremony. Until then, I didn't even know you existed. Christopher felt something stir in his chest, a strange and uncomfortable sensation that took him a moment to identify as hope. And what did you think when you found out? Grace lowered her eyes, her cheeks flushing again. I was terrified, she admitted. But I also thought you were very handsome. And when I read about your business achievements, about how you built your own division of the company at 25, I was impressed. Impressed? Christopher took a step toward her without realizing it. You're not just a spoiled heir living off the family fortune, Grace said, finally raising her eyes to meet his. You're intelligent, ambitious, hardworking. Even though this was arranged, I thought that maybe it wouldn't be a complete death sentence. The air between them seemed to charge with electricity. Christopher could smell her soft perfume, fresh gardenias with a touch of something uniquely Grace, and had to fight the urge to reach out and touch her flushed face. Grace, he began, his voice rough. We should go down for breakfast, she interrupted quickly, as if sensing the danger in the intimate moment they were sharing. Margaret must be waiting. Christopher nodded, though every fiber of his being wanted to prolong that moment. Of course. Afterward you can show me where you'd like to settle in. We have several suites to choose from. As they descended the marble staircase together, Grace was struck by the austere beauty of the Montgomery mansion. Every piece of furniture was a work of art. Every rug a family heirloom, every painting worth more than her old house entirely. But despite all the opulence, there was a coldness in the air that made her shiver. Margaret waited for them in the formal dining room, a woman in her 60s with graying hair styled in an impeccable bun and kind eyes that sparkled when they saw Grace. Mrs. Montgomery, Margaret said warmly, and Grace almost flinched at hearing her new name. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. I hope you slept well. Thank you, Margaret. And please call me Grace. Of course, dear. Margaret smiled genuinely. I prepared your favorite dishes, Mr. Christopher, and also some options I thought Grace might enjoy. As they sat at the mahogany table that could easily seat 12, Christopher watched Grace interact with Margaret. There was a natural kindness in her manner, a genuine warmth that contrasted dramatically with the artificial behavior of the women he was accustomed to meeting in his social position. Margaret, how long have you worked here? Grace asked, serving herself fresh fruit. 22 years next month, Margaret replied proudly. I've watched this young man grow up since he was a sad little boy, trying to pretend he didn't miss his mother. Margaret, Christopher warned gently, but without real irritation. Oh, he doesn't like it when I talk about that, Margaret told Grace with a conspiratorial wink. But between us women, I can tell you he has a very big heart. It's just hidden under many layers of protection. Grace looked at Christopher, and for a moment their eyes met across the table. There was something there, a fragile but real connection, that made both their hearts beat slightly faster. Maybe, Grace said softly, never looking away from him, some protections are necessary, but maybe it's time to let some of them go. Christopher felt his breath catch. There was a subtle invitation in her words, an offer of truce that he didn't know if he was brave enough to accept. but for the first time in years, he found himself wanting to try. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystals from the central chandelier, creating an atmosphere of opulence that rivaled European palaces. New York's elite moved across the marble floor like carefully orchestrated pieces on a social chessboard, their haute couture gowns and impeccable tuxedos reflecting the wealth that ran through their veins like blue blood. The aroma of white roses and French champagne hung in the air, mixed with expensive perfumes, and the discreet murmur of conversations where each word was worth millions. Grace nervously adjusted the strap of the emerald green dress that Christopher had sent to her suite that afternoon. The Italian silk fabric embraced her curves elegantly without being vulgar, the neckline revealing just enough of the creamy skin of her shoulders to be sophisticated. It was a stunning piece that cost more than she earned in 6 months at her old job, but wearing such expensive clothes only made her feel more like an imposter. "You look beautiful," Christopher murmured beside her, his low voice carrying a sincerity that made her blush. He was devastatingly elegant in his tailored tuxedo, the black fabric highlighting the breadth of his shoulders and the strong line of his jaw. In the past 3 days since their breakfast conversation, there had been a fragile truce between them, a careful dance of courtesy and occasional moments of shared vulnerability. "Thank you," Grace whispered, her fingers lightly squeezing the arm he offered. "I still can't believe I'm here. At New York's most exclusive charity ball." Christopher raised an eyebrow, an almost genuine smile playing on his lips. "Better get used to it. As my wife, you'll be expected at all these events." The word wife still sounded strange between them, loaded with unresolved complications and unmade promises. But there was something different in the way Christopher said it now. Less like an accusation and more like a possibility. They circulated through the ballroom, Christopher introducing Grace to the magnates and socialites who dominated New York high society. She smiled graciously, answered questions with discreet intelligence, and gradually Christopher realized he had completely underestimated her ability to navigate that treacherous world. Grace wasn't just beautiful, she was genuinely charming, interested in people in a way that transcended self-interest. "So you're the mysterious new Mrs. Montgomery," said Victoria Ashford, wife of an oil magnate, her eyes assessing Grace from head to toe like a predator analyzing potential prey. "I heard you had a whirlwind romance." "Sometimes," Grace replied softly, her fingers finding Christopher's almost instinctively. "The heart knows what it wants before the mind has time to complicate things." Christopher felt an electric shock run up his arm where she touched him. Her response had been perfect, true in its own twisted way, but satisfying high society's voracious curiosity without revealing anything real. "How romantic," Victoria murmured, but Christopher detected a note of disdain in her voice that made him tense. That's when a familiar and unwelcome voice cut through the air like a razor. "Christopher, darling, what a delightful surprise." Veronica Kingsley approached them like a panther in motion, her blood-red dress clinging to her sculptural body in a way that left little to the imagination. Her platinum blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her bare shoulders, and her ice-blue eyes sparkled with barely disguised malice. She had been Christopher's girlfriend for 2 years, a relationship that ended abruptly when he discovered she was selling information about his business strategies to competitors. "Veronica," Christopher said coldly, his arm tensing under Grace's hand. "And this must be the famous new wife," Veronica continued, her eyes analyzing Grace with the precision of a surgeon looking for where to cut. "Grace, isn't it? Such a common name." Grace felt the venom in the words but maintained her polite smile. "Veronica, I imagine. Christopher mentioned you." "Did he?" Veronica laughed, a crystalline sound that cut like glass. "I hope he was kind. After all, Christopher and I shared so many intimate memories." The ballroom around them seemed to grow quieter, other guests subconsciously sensing the drama unfolding. Christopher could feel the tension radiating from Grace, though she maintained her exterior composure with a strength that impressed him. "Actually," Veronica continued, clearly enjoying the discomfort she was causing, "it's funny how things change. Christopher used to say he'd never marry for convenience, that he'd rather die single than be forced into an arranged marriage like his father. I suppose desperate circumstances called for desperate measures." Grace paled slightly, But it was Christopher who reacted. His eyes narrowed dangerously, and when he spoke, his voice carried the power and authority of someone accustomed to destroying empires with a few well-chosen words. "Veronica," he said, taking a step forward that effectively placed Grace behind the protection of his body. "How interesting that you mentioned desperate measures, especially considering that the last time we spoke, you were begging me not to expose your unauthorized business activities to all of New York society." Veronica's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "But perhaps," Christopher continued, his voice becoming lower and more dangerous, "you've forgotten how uncomfortable it can be when someone reveals inconvenient truths in public. Should I refresh your memory?" The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica looked around and realized that several nearby guests were obviously listening, their eyes gleaming with anticipation of a juicy scandal. She had overestimated her position and underestimated how much Christopher would protect Grace, even if it was just to keep up appearances. "I don't know what you're talking about," Veronica said, but her voice had lost its previous confidence. "Don't you?" Christopher smiled, but it was an expression cold as Arctic winter. "Then perhaps we should discuss those emails you sent to Harrison and Associates last fall, or the exact amount they paid for information about our acquisition strategy for Peterson Industries." Veronica visibly paled beneath her perfect makeup. "Christopher. Or," he continued relentlessly, "we can simply agree that this conversation has come to an end. Your choice, Veronica." For a moment that seemed like an eternity. Veronica visibly struggled between her wounded pride and the real threat of total public humiliation. Finally, self-preservation won. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile that didn't come close to reaching her eyes. "It was charming to meet you, Grace. I'm sure we'll see each other again." With that, she turned and walked away, but Christopher could see the furious rigidity in her shoulders and knew he had made an even more dangerous enemy. Grace remained silent for several seconds after Veronica disappeared into the crowd. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and slightly trembling. "You didn't have to do that." Christopher turned to face her, surprised by her reaction. "Do what? Defend me like that? Especially if it means you now have more problems with her." There was something in the way Grace said it, a combination of gratitude and confusion, that made Christopher's heart race. He realized he had protected her instinctively, without thinking about the consequences or his own interests. It had been a purely protective act, born from something much deeper than matrimonial obligation. "She was being cruel to you," he said simply. "I don't tolerate unnecessary cruelty." "But she wasn't completely wrong, was she?" Grace asked softly, her green eyes searching his. "About the arranged marriage?" Christopher hesitated, realizing he had reached a crucial moment. He could lie, maintain the facade, or he could be honest for the first time in weeks. "No," he admitted. "She wasn't wrong about that. But she was wrong about everything else." "Like what?" "Like assuming you're anything less than extraordinary," Christopher said, the words coming out before he could censor them. "Like thinking I would regret being here with you tonight." Grace caught her breath, her eyes widening slightly. "Christopher, dance with me," he said abruptly, extending his hand. It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't an order. It was something in between, loaded with unspoken possibilities. Grace hesitated for just a moment before placing her hand in his. The touch sent waves of heat up Christopher's arm, and he led her to the dance floor where other couples danced to the sound of a classical waltz. When he pulled her into his arms, Grace felt as if the world had shrunk to just the two of them. His hand on her waist was firm but gentle, their intertwined fingers creating a connection that seemed much more intimate than it should. She could feel the heat of his body through the thin fabric of his shirt, the masculine scent of his aftershave, mixed with something uniquely Christopher that made her want to move even closer. "You dance well," Christopher murmured near her ear, his warm breath making her shiver. "My mother insisted on lessons when I was a child," Grace replied, her voice slightly breathless. "She said a lady should always know how to conduct herself in society." Your mother was right. They danced in silence for a few minutes, lost in the music and unexpected closeness. Grace could feel the eyes of other guests on them, but for the first time since the wedding, she didn't care about the speculation. There was something happening there on the dance floor, something real and palpable that transcended their public roles. "Grace," Christopher said softly, making her raise her eyes to meet his. What she saw there made her tremble. It wasn't love, not yet. But there was a warmth, a possibility that hadn't existed before. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For protecting me. For making me feel like I was worth protecting." Christopher felt something move in his chest, a sweet pain he hadn't felt in years. "Grace, I know this isn't real," she continued quickly, as if wanting to say everything before she lost her courage. "I know we're just two strangers trying to make the best of an impossible situation. But tonight you made me feel like I could really be your wife. And that means more to me than you'll ever know." The music came to an end, but they remained in each other's arms for one more moment, their eyes connected in silent communication that said more than words ever could. And while other forces conspired around them, while Veronica watched them from the periphery, with eyes full of hatred and plans for revenge already forming in her calculating mind, Christopher and Grace were lost in the first real glimpse that maybe, just maybe, this forced marriage could become something neither had dared to hope for. The night breeze of Connecticut carried the aroma of jasmine and roses from the Montgomery Mansion's garden, creating an olfactory symphony that danced through the marble balcony where Grace found herself alone. 3 weeks had passed since the charity ball, and something subtle but undeniable had changed between her and Christopher. Breakfast conversations lasted longer. Shared silences were less uncomfortable, and there were moments, brief but intense, where she caught him looking at her with an expression that made her heart race dangerously. The full moon hung low in the sky like a luminous pearl, bathing the meticulously maintained gardens in silver light that transformed every leaf and petal into an ethereal work of art. Grace leaned against the stone balustrade, the light fabric of her silk robe whispering against her bare legs as the night breeze caressed her exposed skin. She couldn't sleep. Again. Since the wedding, sleep had become a reluctant visitor, always fleeing when she tried to quiet herself enough to rest. The sound of footsteps on marble made her turn, and her heart leaped when she saw Christopher emerging from the shadows of the house. He had traded his formal suit for dark linen pants and a white shirt, with the first buttons open, revealing a tantalizing expanse of bronzed skin that made Grace's mouth go dry. His dark hair was slightly tousled, as if he too had been fighting insomnia, and there was a vulnerability in his blue-gray eyes that she rarely had the chance to see. "Can't sleep either?" he asked softly, approaching her with cautious movements, as if afraid of startling her. "The moon is too bright," Grace lied, knowing the real reason for her insomnia was the man now standing a few feet away, emanating a magnetism that left her completely undone. Christopher leaned against the balustrade beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, but Grace could feel the heat from his body radiating through the space between them. "I used to come here when I was a child," he said, looking out at the moon-bathed gardens. "Whenever my father was particularly difficult." "Difficult how?" Grace asked gently, thrilled by the rare opportunity to glimpse the man behind the carefully constructed mask. Christopher remained silent for so long that Grace thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a long-buried pain that made her heart contract with empathy. "Harold Montgomery doesn't believe in weakness," he said, his hands clenching into fists on the cold stone. "Crying was weakness. Missing my mother was weakness. Wanting affection or approval was weakness. By 10, I had learned not to want anything that could be used against me." "Christopher," Grace whispered, fighting the urge to reach out and touch him. "He sent me to boarding schools in Switzerland when I was 11, Christopher continued, as if the words were water pouring from a broken dam. "Said I needed to become a man. That Lancaster Academy would make me the kind of heir the Montgomery family deserved." "You must have felt so alone," Grace said, her voice breaking with emotion. Christopher turned to look at her, and in the soft moonlight, Grace could see unshed tears shining in his eyes. "Alone isn't even the right word. It was like I was a ghost watching other people live real lives while I just existed." Grace couldn't contain herself any longer. She reached out and covered his hand with her small, warm fingers, the touch sending waves of electricity up Christopher's arm. "You're not alone now," she said softly, her words loaded with a sincerity that hit him like lightning. Christopher looked at their intertwined hands, his large and bronzed, hers small and pale as porcelain, and felt something come undone in his chest. "Grace, tell me about your mother," she asked gently. "What was she like?" A melancholy smile touched Christopher's lips. "She was light, pure light. She sang to me every night, even when she was sick. Read stories with different voices for each character, made chocolate chip cookies on Saturdays and let me lick the bowl. She loved you," Grace said, not as a question, but as an absolute certainty. "Yes," Christopher admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "And when she died, it was like all the color had drained from the world. Harold wouldn't let me cry at the funeral. Said Montgomerys don't show weakness in public." Tears slid silently down Grace's cheeks as she absorbed the magnitude of the pain Christopher had carried alone for so long. "You were only 8 years old. You were a child who needed to grieve his mother." "You're the first person who understands that," Christopher said, turning completely to face her. "Everyone always said how strong I was, how impressive it was that I had gotten over it so well." "You didn't get over it," Grace observed softly. "You just learned to bury the pain so deep you pretended it didn't exist." Christopher stared at her with an intensity that made the air between them vibrate with tension. "How do you know that?" Grace lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking. "Because I did the same thing, not with death, but with other forms of abandonment." "Tell me," Christopher asked, his voice rough with emotion. Grace took a deep breath, gathering courage. "My father was always distant, obsessed with business, with success, with keeping up appearances. My mother, she tried to compensate, but she was so starved for attention herself that she ended up using me as a confidant for her own marital unhappiness." "That shouldn't have been your responsibility," Christopher said, his fingers automatically tightening around hers. "No," Grace agreed, "but when you grow up being everyone's emotional support, you learn to hide your own needs. You learn that your value lies in being useful, in not causing trouble, in being the perfect daughter who never asks for too much." Christopher felt a deep connection forming between them, the recognition of two wounded souls who had learned to survive by hiding their vulnerabilities from the world. "That's why you didn't fight the arranged marriage." "Partly," Grace admitted, "but also because part of me hoped that maybe, finally, I could have a family of my own. Someone who would choose me, even if the circumstances were imperfect." The silence that followed was loaded with mutual understanding. They stood there, hands intertwined, looking at each other in the moonlight, and for the first time since they'd met, the carefully constructed masks began to crumble completely. "Grace," Christopher said, his voice low and intense, "I married you believing you were like all the others. Gold-digging, manipulative, fake. And now?" she asked, barely daring to breathe. "Now I realize you're everything I always wanted to find but never believed existed," he admitted, taking a step closer. "You're kind without being naive, strong without being cruel, true without being too vulnerable." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. "Christopher, these past few weeks," he continued, now so close she could feel his warm breath against her skin. "Watching you with Margaret, seeing how you transform every room you enter, realizing how you truly care about people, you're teaching me how to feel again." "You make me feel valued," Grace whispered. "For the first time in my life, someone sees me, really sees me, and doesn't run away." Christopher raised his free hand and gently caressed Grace's wet cheek, his thumb tracing the path of her tears. "You're beautiful," he murmured. "Not just on the outside, but inside. Your soul is the most beautiful thing I've ever encountered." The air between them was charged with electricity, each shared breath creating an intimacy that transcended anything either of them had experienced before. Grace could feel his magnetism pulling her closer, and for the first time since the wedding she didn't resist. "Grace," Christopher whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "May I?" Instead of answering with words, Grace rose slightly on her tiptoes, closing the distance between them, in a silent invitation that made Christopher's heart race violently. When their lips finally met, it was as if the entire world stopped spinning. The kiss began tentative, almost reverent, but when Grace sighed softly against his mouth, Christopher pulled her closer, deepening the connection with a passion that surprised him with its intensity. Grace's lips were soft as rose petals, and she tasted of unmade promises and finally realized dreams. Christopher could feel her delicate body molding against his, her arms wrapping around his neck in a surrender that was both innocent and incendiary. When she moaned softly, a small needy sound that vibrated against his lips, he felt like he was drowning in the best possible way. Grace had been kissed before, but never like this. Never with this combination of tenderness and hunger, reverence and passion. Christopher kissed her as if she were precious and desirable at the same time, his large hands holding her as if she might break, but with a firmness that made her feel completely safe and completely alive. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily, their foreheads touching as they tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened between them. "Grace," Christopher whispered, his voice rough with emotion and barely contained desire. "I know," she replied softly, understanding what he couldn't articulate. "I feel it too." They remained embraced under the moonlight, and both knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer two strangers trapped in a marriage of convenience. They were two people who had found in each other the possibility of something neither had dared to hope for. True love, born from the ashes of a business arrangement. "Stay with me tonight," Christopher asked, his voice vulnerable in a way he had never allowed before. "Not for... just stay. I don't want to be alone tonight." Grace looked into his eyes and saw not the powerful heir or the ruthless CEO, but simply Christopher, a man who had been hurt too much and was finally allowing someone to get close enough to begin healing those wounds. "Yes," she whispered, and when he led her by the hand back into the house, both knew their lives had changed irrevocably. The seed of passion had been planted, and nothing would ever be the same. Autumn had arrived early in Connecticut, tinting the leaves of the century-old oaks on the Montgomery property in golden and crimson tones that danced in the cool morning breeze. Grace gazed through the window of the suite she now shared with Christopher, a cup of lukewarm tea forgotten in her trembling hands. 3 months had passed since that night on the balcony that changed everything between them. 3 months of intimate discoveries, shared laughter, and a passion that grew more intense each day. But now, sitting on the edge of the king-size bed where she had found a love she never believed possible, Grace felt as if the world was crumbling beneath her feet. The small pharmacy test lay on the nightstand, its 2 bright pink lines screaming a truth she was still struggling to fully process. She was pregnant. The sound of the shower running in the adjacent bathroom created a constant background that seemed to amplify the tumult of chaotic thoughts in her mind. Christopher was in there, oblivious to the bomb about to explode in their carefully reconstructed lives. Over the past months, they had found a delicate but powerful rhythm, growing closer each day, building something real on the fragile foundation of an arranged marriage. And now this. Grace pressed a hand against her still flat stomach, marveled and terrified at the same time. A life was growing there, a combination of her and Christopher that would forever be a bridge between their worlds. But how would he react? They had been careful, but not careful enough, lost in the nights of passion that consumed them when they were in each other's arms. The memory of the previous night made her blush even in her state of panic. Christopher had returned late from a business trip to Boston, and when he found her waiting for him in the living room, wearing only a silk nightgown he had bought her in Paris, the intensity of desire in his eyes had made her entire body ignite. They had barely made it to the bedroom before he pressed her against the door, his large hands exploring every curve of her body as if it were the first time. "I missed you so much," he had murmured against her neck, his voice rough with need. 3 days felt like 3 years. "Show me how much," she had whispered back, and Christopher needed no more encouragement. He had taken her right there, against the door, with a desperate urgency that left her breathless and completely satisfied. But now, in the cold light of morning, Grace wondered if Christopher would interpret the pregnancy as a trap, as a calculated scheme by a woman who had finally found a way to secure her position in the Montgomery family forever. The thought made her feel physically sick. The sound of the water stopping jolted her from her tortured thoughts. Christopher would emerge from the bathroom in a matter of minutes, and she needed to decide how to tell him, or whether to tell him at all. No, she couldn't hide this. Not after everything they had built together. Honesty had become the foundation of their relationship, and she wouldn't destroy that now, no matter how frightening the outcome. The bathroom door opened, releasing a cloud of scented steam that carried the aroma of Christopher's expensive soap. He emerged wearing only a towel wrapped around his waist, drops of water still glistening on his muscled chest, and dark hair slicked back. At 29, Christopher Montgomery was devastatingly beautiful, and even in her state of extreme nervousness, Grace felt a familiar wave of desire course through her body. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, approaching her with a smile that completely transformed his austere face. Over the past months, Christopher had learned to smile again, real smiles that reached his eyes and made Grace's heart skip. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," Grace admitted, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. Christopher stopped immediately, his sharp business instincts detecting something wrong in her tone. "What happened? Are you okay?" Grace watched him approach, each fluid movement revealing the natural grace of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and conquering everything he desired. But there was also a vulnerability in him now, an emotional openness she had helped cultivate, that made moments like this even more precious. "Christopher," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to tell you something." He sat on the bed beside her immediately, his large hands finding hers with a gentleness that still surprised her. "Anything? You know you can tell me anything." Grace looked into the blue-gray eyes that had become her refuge, seeking courage in depths she once thought were cold, but now knew were simply protected. I took a test this morning." "What kind of test?" Christopher asked, but Grace could see the exact moment when understanding began to form in his eyes. His expression changed subtly, shifting from concern to something much more complex. With trembling hands, Grace picked up the pregnancy test from the nightstand and placed it between them. The two pink lines seemed to glow in the soft morning light, an undeniable declaration that would change their lives forever. Christopher went completely still, his eyes fixed on the small plastic device as if it were a venomous snake. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications, until Grace felt like she could no longer breathe. "Christopher," she whispered, her voice broken with fear. "Say something. Anything." When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, Grace saw a storm of emotions passing across his face. Surprise, fear, confusion, and something else she couldn't identify. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I took 3 tests," Grace admitted. "All positive, and I'm almost a week late." Christopher ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture Grace had learned to recognize as a sign that he was struggling to process complex information. "How did this happen? Do you really need me to explain?" Grace tried to joke, but her voice came out more bitter than intended. "No, Christopher shook his head, clearly trying to organize his thoughts. "We were careful. Most of the time." "Most of the time," Grace repeated softly. "But not always. Especially when you came back from trips or when I couldn't keep my hands off you," Christopher finished, a note of something that might have been wonder in his voice. Grace studied his face intently, looking for signs of anger or accusation. "Do you think I planned this? That it was a trap?" The question seemed to hit Christopher like a slap. He turned completely to face her, his hands cupping her face with an intensity that made her catch her breath. "Grace, no," he said firmly. "Not for a second do I believe you planned this. You're many wonderful things, but manipulative isn't one of them." "Then why do you look so—" Grace searched for the right word. "Shocked." Christopher laughed, but it was a strange sound, loaded with disbelief. "Because in my entire life I never imagined I'd be a father. I never allowed it to be a real possibility in my mind." "Why not?" "Because," Christopher said, his hands sliding from her shoulders to hold her hands again, "I was always afraid I'd be like Harold, cold, distant, incapable of giving a child the love they deserve." Grace felt tears forming in her eyes as she understood the magnitude of Christopher's fears. "Christopher, you're nothing like your father. Not even close. How can you be so sure?" "Because," Grace said, bringing one of his hands to her still flat stomach, "I see how you take care of me, how you protect the people you love, how you're learning to trust again. A child would be incredibly lucky to have you as a father." Christopher looked at where his hand was pressed against Grace's abdomen, and Grace could see the exact moment when reality fully settled in. There was a life growing there, their life, Their baby. My God, he whispered, wonder finally breaking through the shock. We're going to have a baby. We are, Grace confirmed, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. If you want to. If we want to. Christopher stared at her as if she had lost her mind. If I want to. Grace, this is the best news of my life. The words hit Grace like a wave of relief, so powerful she almost collapsed. Really? Really? Christopher said, pulling her into his arms and holding her against his bare chest. Grace could feel his heart beating rapidly against her cheek, could feel the tremor of emotion in his muscles. I love you, Grace. And the idea that you're carrying our child, it's like all my dreams that I didn't even know I had are coming true at once. I love you too, Grace whispered against his skin, breathing in the familiar scent that had become her refuge. But I'm terrified. What if I don't know how to be a mother? What if I mess everything up? Christopher pulled her away enough to look into her eyes, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. Then we'll figure it out together. We were both hurt by our parents, Grace. That means we know exactly what not to do. And more importantly, he said, gently kissing her lips, we know how to love each other. This baby will grow up surrounded by so much love, they'll never question whether they're wanted. Grace felt like her heart might explode with happiness. You really want this? Want to have a family with me? I want everything with you, Christopher said, his voice loaded with a conviction that made her tremble. I want to wake up every morning with you in my arms. I want to raise our children together. I want to grow old beside you and still be as in love with you at 80 as I am now. Our children? Grace asked, a smile playing on her lips. Plural? Christopher smiled, that transformative smile that still made her stomach flip. Well, this baby is going to need siblings, right? The Montgomery mansion is too big for just 3 people. Grace laughed through her tears, finally allowing pure happiness to consume her. 3 people for now. For now, Christopher agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of the future and infinite possibilities. As they kissed, both lost in the magnitude of the love they had found and the life they had created together, neither could imagine that dark forces were already moving against them. That somewhere in the city, Veronica Kingsley was plotting her revenge with a patience and malice that would soon test every fiber of the love they had built. Richard Donovan's office in the heart of Manhattan radiated power and barely contained ambition, its dark mahogany furniture and panoramic city view creating an environment where shadowy business was conducted with the same ease others drank coffee. The silk curtains were partially drawn against the December sunset, casting dramatic shadows across the angular face of a man who had built his fortune destroying others' dreams. At 45, Richard was the embodiment of ambition without scruples. Impeccably styled grey hair, custom suits that cost more than luxury cars, and cold, steel-grey eyes that never showed mercy. Veronica Kingsley sat in the Italian leather armchair across from his desk, her long legs crossed with calculated elegance, her red Valentino dress hugging every curve of her sculptural body. 6 months had passed since the public humiliation at the charity ball, 6 months of rage fermenting in her chest like sour wine until it transformed into something much more dangerous, a thirst for absolute revenge. They looked disgustingly happy, Veronica said, her voice loaded with venom as she slid a series of photographs across the mahogany desk. The images, taken by a private investigator she had hired, showed Christopher and Grace in various intimate moments, leaving restaurants hand in hand, Grace clearly pregnant now at 5 months, Christopher with a protective hand on her back, both smiling with a radiant happiness that made Veronica feel nauseous. Richard picked up one of the photographs, studying it with the precision of a predator analyzing its prey. The pregnancy adds an interesting complication. Montgomery was always protective, but now with a pregnant wife. Exactly why we need to act quickly, Veronica interrupted, standing and walking to the panoramic window. The city stretched below her like a chessboard, and she saw herself as the queen about to execute a devastating checkmate. Christopher is more vulnerable than he's ever been. He finally opened his heart, which means we have a perfect target to destroy. Richard smiled, an expression that didn't come close to reaching his icy eyes. And what exactly do you have in mind, dear Veronica? We're going to make Christopher believe his precious Grace is exactly what he always feared she was, a schemer who set everything up from the beginning, Veronica said, turning to face Richard with eyes gleaming with malice. We'll plant evidence that she and her father planned this entire arranged marriage charade, including the pregnancy. Interesting, Richard murmured, leaning back in his leather chair. But Montgomery isn't stupid. He'll want substantial proof before believing anything that could destroy his marriage. And we'll give him that proof, Veronica said, approaching the desk with the grace of a panther preparing to attack. Forged documents, falsified bank records, fabricated emails, everything pointing to an elaborate conspiracy between Grace and Henry Whitmore to seduce the Montgomery heir. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed with the scope of her plan. That will require considerable resources. Forgery experts, hackers, actors to stage compromising situations. Money is no object, Veronica said, opening her Hermes bag and withdrawing an already filled check. 200,000 to start. More is needed. Richard took the check, his eyes widening slightly at the amount. You really want to destroy them, don't you? I want to see Christopher Montgomery on his knees, begging forgiveness for rejecting me, Veronica said, her voice low and dangerous. I want him to lose everything that matters to him, his wife, his child, his trust in his own judgment. And when he's completely destroyed, maybe he'll finally appreciate what he lost when he chose me as an enemy. And I, Richard added with a cruel smile, will finally have my revenge against Montgomery Enterprises. Christopher cost me 3 important contracts last year with his aggressive business tactics. It's time to return the favor. Veronica sat down again, crossing her legs with feline elegance. So, how do we proceed? Richard opened a drawer in his desk, pulling out a thick folder. I already have some information about their habits and routines. Thanks to my relationship with one of the cleaning staff at Montgomery Enterprises, I know Christopher works late on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Grace is usually home alone those nights. Perfect, Veronica murmured. A lonely wife is more susceptible to unexpected visitors. We'll need compromising photographs, Richard continued, his calculating mind already working out the details. Something suggesting infidelity on her part. I have an associate, Marcus Webb, who could play the lover. He's attractive enough and completely without scruples. And the documents? Veronica asked, leaning forward with interest. I have contacts in the digital underworld, Richard said, his fingers drumming on the desk. For 50,000, they can create a complete digital history of communications between Grace and her father, dating from before the marriage. Emails discussing strategies to hook Christopher, suspicious bank transfers, even fake audio recordings. Veronica felt a wave of sadistic excitement course through her body. What if we added something about the pregnancy? Suggestions that she deliberately stopped taking birth control to get pregnant and secure her position. Brilliant, Richard said, genuinely impressed. That would hit Christopher exactly where it hurts most, his ability to trust his own judgment about people. When do we start? Veronica asked, barely able to contain her impatience. Preparation will take a few weeks, Richard said, picking up a calendar. We need everything to be perfect. One poorly forged piece of evidence, and the whole plan crumbles. But if we do this right, he smiled cruelly, Christopher Montgomery will never recover from the betrayal he believes he's suffered. Veronica stood, smoothing the red dress she knew made her look irresistible. And Grace? Grace Whitmore Montgomery, Richard said, savoring each syllable. We'll discover that crossing dangerous people has devastating consequences. When we're done with her, Christopher will see her as the most treacherous woman who ever lived. Perfect, Veronica whispered, heading for the door. Send me weekly updates. And Richard? Yes? Don't fail. I don't accept failure when it comes to destroying Christopher Montgomery's happiness. After Veronica left, Richard remained in his office, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. He had ruined families before, had destroyed marriages and empires with equal ease, but there was something particularly delicious about this project. Christopher Montgomery had always seemed untouchable, protected by his wealth and power. But love, true love, made even the most powerful men vulnerable. Richard picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Marcus, it's Richard Donovan. I have a job for you. A very well-paid job that involves destroying a marriage. While the gears of conspiracy began moving in the darkness of Manhattan, Christopher and Grace were 300 miles north, oblivious to the storm preparing to devastate their lives. Christopher lay in bed, a protective hand over Grace's rounded belly, feeling the gentle movements of their unborn child. "She's kicking again," Grace murmured sleepily, covering his hand with hers. Christopher corrected with a smile, and he clearly inherited the Montgomery family determination. "Or the Whitmore family stubbornness," Grace countered, turning in his arms. Christopher kissed her gently, marveling as always at the perfection of the moment. In a few months, they would be 3. In a few months, their family would be complete in a way he had never dared to dream. If only he knew that evil forces were already conspiring to transform his personal paradise into the deepest of hells. The March storm lashed against the windows of the Montgomery mansion with a fury that mirrored the turbulence about to devastate the lives within. Grace was in the library, nestled in Christopher's favorite leather armchair, one hand resting on her 7-month belly while she read aloud to the baby growing inside her. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, creating an atmosphere of domestic peace that had become her refuge in the past months of marital happiness. "And then the prince realized that true love had been there all along," she murmured, closing the fairy tale book with a tender smile. "Good thing you haven't been born yet to question these happy endings, little one." The sound of tires on wet gravel announced Christopher's arrival, earlier than expected from his meeting in Manhattan. Grace stood with some difficulty, her hand automatically going to her aching back, and walked to the window to see him exit the Aston Martin. Even through the torrential rain, she could see something was wrong. His movements were rigid, too controlled, as if he were fighting to contain an inner storm that rivaled the one raging outside. When Christopher entered the library minutes later, Grace felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. His face was pale as marble, his blue-gray eyes burning with an intensity she hadn't seen since the early days of their marriage. In his hands, he carried a brown leather folder that seemed to weigh more than it should. "Christopher?" Grace approached him, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. "What happened?" "You look—" "Don't touch me," he said, his voice low and dangerous, stepping back as if her touch burned. The rejection was like a physical slap, making Grace recoil with eyes wide with shock. I don't understand," she stammered, one hand automatically going to her belly as if she could protect the baby from the tension that suddenly charged the air. Christopher threw the folder onto the coffee table with enough force to make the crystal ornaments tremble. Documents scattered like poisonous petals, photographs, bank statements, email printouts. Grace saw her own face in some of the images, but there was something wrong, something she couldn't immediately process. 9 months? Christopher said, each word coming out like ice shards. 9 months I was a complete idiot, believing every word that came out of your lying mouth. Christopher, what are you talking about? Grace approached the table, her eyes scanning the scattered documents. What are these things? Evidence, he replied cruelly. Evidence of who you really are, of who you've always been. Grace picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands. The image showed her apparently embracing a man she had never seen in her life, a blonde, attractive man who was kissing her passionately while she seemed to return the kiss. The photo was dated just 2 weeks ago. This isn't me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Christopher, I've never seen this man in my life. This isn't real. Not real? Christopher laughed, but it was a humorless sound that made Grace flinch. And these emails aren't real either. These bank transfers, these audio recordings where you and your father discuss how to hook the big fish. Grace picked up one of the email printouts, her eyes scanning lines she supposedly had written. Dad, Christopher is finally starting to trust me. The pregnancy was the perfect finishing touch. Now he'll never be able to get rid of me. In a few months, half the Montgomery fortune will be ours. I never wrote this, Grace said, her voice rising an octave in desperation. Christopher, you have to believe me. I never, ever... Stop, Christopher roared, making her step back. Stop with these lies. I've seen the evidence, heard the recordings. You and Henry Whitmore planned everything from the beginning, the arranged marriage, the seduction, even the pregnancy. The pregnancy, Grace pressed both hands against her belly, tears beginning to stream down her face. How can you question this? This baby is ours, Christopher, ours. Is it? Christopher approached her, his intimidating presence making her back up until her back met the bookshelf. Or is it just another tool in your elaborate manipulation? Tell me, Grace, when did you stop taking birth control, before or after you decided you needed a permanent guarantee of access to the Montgomery fortune? The words were like stab wounds, each one deeper than the last. Grace felt like she was drowning, struggling to breathe, while the man she loved more than life itself destroyed her with accusations she couldn't comprehend. "I love you," she whispered, extending a trembling hand toward him. "Christopher, I love you so much it hurts. How can you believe I would do this?" "Because," Christopher said, picking up another photograph and wielding it like a weapon, "you're exactly like all the others. Better actress, more convincing, but in the end, only interested in what I can give you." The second photograph showed Grace apparently entering an expensive hotel with the same blonde man, their heads close like conspiratorial lovers. Grace studied the image with growing horror, realizing how meticulously it had been falsified. Even her clothes were perfect, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had never been to that place, had never met that man. "This is fake," she said, her voice gaining strength through desperation. "Christopher, someone is doing this to us. Someone wants to separate us." "Who?" Christopher demanded. "Who would have the resources and motivation to create such elaborate evidence?" "Veronica," Grace said immediately. "Or any of your business competitors. Christopher, you yourself said you have enemies." "Veronica?" Christopher laughed bitterly. "You really think I'm pathetic enough to blame my ex-girlfriend for my wife's betrayal? That's even lower than I expected, even from you." Grace felt as if he had ripped her heart from her chest with his bare hands. The man who had held her face with infinite tenderness, who had whispered promises of eternal love against her skin, who had cried with joy when he learned of the pregnancy, had disappeared completely. In his place stood a cold and cruel stranger who looked at her as if she were less than nothing. "Please," she begged, tears flowing freely now. "Please, Christopher, listen to me. Remember who we are together. Remember how we got here." "I remember," Christopher said, his voice low and venomous. "I remember every sweet lie you whispered in my ear. Every false I love you. Every intimate moment you faked while planning how to exploit me." "No," Grace shook her head violently. "No, that's not true. Everything I felt, everything we lived together was real. Christopher, please, get out." The word fell between them like a death sentence. "What?" Grace whispered. "Get out of my house," Christopher repeated, each syllable pronounced with deadly precision. "Get out of my life. I don't want to see your lying face anymore. Christopher, I'm pregnant with your child." "I'm questioning that too," he said cruelly. "After all, if you were cheating on me, who knows whose child it really is?" Grace felt as if he had physically struck her. Her hand flew to her belly, instinctively protecting the baby growing inside her. The baby she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, was Christopher's. "How can you say that?" she whispered, her voice broken. "How can you question our child?" "Easily," Christopher replied coldly. "Considering I apparently don't know the woman I married." Grace studied him, desperately searching for some glimpse of the man she loved beneath the mask of anger and pain. What happened to trusting each other? To being honest? To all the vows you broke? Christopher interrupted. "Consider our agreement dissolved." Grace realized there was nothing she could say, no argument she could make that would reach him through the wall of conviction someone had built with false but convincing evidence. The man who had learned to love again had disappeared, replaced by the original Christopher Montgomery, cold, suspicious, protected against any vulnerability. With dignity she didn't know she possessed, Grace straightened her shoulders and walked to the table where her wedding ring sparkled in the firelight. With trembling hands, she removed it and placed it on the documents that had destroyed her life. "I loved you," she said softly, her voice loaded with infinite sadness. "I loved you with every fiber of my being, Christopher Montgomery, and this baby is yours no matter what these lies say." Christopher didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the discarded ring as if it were a symbol of his own stupidity. Grace walked toward the door, each step an agony. At the threshold, she turned one last time. "When you discover the truth, and you will, remember that I would still be here if you had chosen to trust the love we built instead of believing fabricated evidence." With that, she left the library, climbed the stairs for the last time and began packing the bags that would take her and her unborn child away from the only home she had ever known. And while the storm continued to rage outside, A much larger storm was just beginning to devastate two lives that had found perfect love, only to see it destroyed by mistrust and cruel manipulation. 2 weeks had passed since Grace left the Montgomery mansion, and Christopher felt like he was living in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The silence that now dominated the corridors, once filled with her musical laughter, was deafening, every room echoing with memories of a happiness he had destroyed with his own hands. He wandered through the rooms like a ghost of himself, his bearded face and bloodshot eyes revealing sleepless nights and days empty of anything resembling life. The library had become his dark sanctuary, where he spent hours staring at the documents that had destroyed his marriage, trying to find flaws that his rational mind insisted should exist. But every time he analyzed the evidence, the photographs, emails, bank transfers, everything seemed perfectly authentic. Too perfectly authentic, whispered a voice in his mind that he refused to hear. "Mr. Christopher?" Margaret Davies' voice cut through his dark contemplation. She stood at the library entrance, a tray of untouched food in her hands, and an expression of maternal concern he had learned to recognize since childhood. "You haven't touched breakfast again." "I'm not hungry," Christopher murmured, not even turning to look at her. He had visibly lost weight in the past 2 weeks, his expensive clothes now hanging loosely on his body that seemed to have collapsed in on itself. Margaret placed the tray on a side table and approached him with the courage of someone who had cared for him when he was a broken boy. "This has to stop, Christopher. You're slowly killing yourself." "Maybe that's what I deserve," he replied bitterly, finally turning to face her. Margaret almost stepped back, seeing the devastation in his eyes. It wasn't just pain, but something much deeper and more corrosive. Self-hatred. "Do you really believe that?" Margaret asked, gesturing to the scattered documents. "That Grace did all these terrible things?" Christopher ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough beard that had grown since he stopped caring about his appearance. "The evidence speaks for itself, Margaret. Evidence can lie," she said softly. "But the heart rarely lies. And I saw how you looked at each other, Christopher. I saw how she made you laugh again. I saw how you flourished beside her." "Then she was an exceptional actress," Christopher replied, but there was less conviction in his voice than before. Margaret sat in the armchair across from him, her kind eyes studying his face with the sharp perception of someone who had watched generations of the Montgomery family destroy themselves with pride and mistrust. "Or you're being manipulated by someone who knows exactly your deepest insecurities." Before Christopher could respond, the library door opened again. Michael Carter, his best friend since Harvard and partner in the company, entered with a grim expression that immediately put Christopher on alert. "We need to talk," Michael said without preamble, closing the door behind him with enough force to echo through the empty rooms. Christopher stood, instinctively adopting the CEO posture he used when facing business crises. "If it's about the Peterson contracts..." "It's about Grace," Michael interrupted, pulling up a chair and sitting without invitation. "And about the fact that you've been completely manipulated." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Christopher felt as if the world had stopped spinning, every muscle in his body tensing as he processed Michael's words. "What do you mean?" Christopher asked, his voice dangerously low. Michael sighed, running a hand through his blonde hair before meeting his friend's eyes. "I hired private investigators. The best money can buy, Christopher. Those evidence pieces against Grace are forgeries. Very sophisticated forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless." Christopher felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "That's impossible. I checked myself." "You checked what was designed for you to find," Michael said, pulling a folder from his leather briefcase. "But when you dig deeper, when you know exactly what to look for, the cracks appear." With slightly trembling hands, Christopher took the folder Michael offered. Inside he found detailed digital forensic analysis reports, evidence of image manipulation, records of bank transfers that proved the accounts supposedly controlled by Grace and Henry Whitmore never existed. "The emails were created using advanced forgery software," Michael explained, watching the color drain from Christopher's face. "The photographs were assembled using deepfake techniques that are virtually undetectable to casual analysis. And the audio recordings, compiled from real phone conversations that were edited and reassembled." Christopher sank into his chair, the folder falling from his numb hands. "How is this possible? Who would have the resources to..." Veronica Kingsley, Michael said simply, in partnership with Richard Donovan. The name hit Christopher like lightning. Richard Donovan, his longtime business rival. A man who had sworn to destroy everything Christopher valued after losing important contracts to Montgomery Enterprises. They planned everything meticulously, Michael continued, his voice gaining cold anger. Veronica provided intimate knowledge about your insecurities and fears, while Donovan provided the technical and financial resources. They studied you two for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "My God," Christopher whispered, the magnitude of his betrayal of Grace beginning to seep into his consciousness like poison. "What have I done?" "You did exactly what they expected you to do," Margaret said gently, but her words carried the weight of a painful accusation. "You allowed your fears to destroy the only real thing you'd ever had in your life." Christopher stood abruptly, beginning to pace like a caged animal. "I need to find her. I need to explain, ask for forgiveness." "It might be too late for that," Michael said softly. Christopher stopped pacing, turning to face his friend with wild eyes. "What do you mean?" "Grace has disappeared, Christopher. After you threw her out, she simply vanished. There are no credit card records, no banking activity, no digital trail. It's like she evaporated." "She's pregnant," Christopher said, panic beginning to creep into his voice. "She's pregnant with my child and alone because of me." "I know," Michael replied gently. "That's why I hired the best investigators in the country to find her. But Christopher, you need to be prepared for the possibility that when we find her, she might not want to forgive you." Christopher sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands, as the full magnitude of his betrayal of Grace settled in his heart like a physical wound. He had questioned the paternity of his child. He had called the woman he loved more than life a liar and manipulator. He had destroyed the only true love he'd ever known because of evidence fabricated by enemies who knew exactly how to manipulate him. "She said she loved me," he whispered through his fingers. "Until the end, even when I was destroying her with cruel words, she said she loved me." "And you didn't believe her," Margaret observed, her voice loaded with infinite sadness. "You chose to believe strangers, instead of trusting the woman who had spent months proving her love through every action, every word, every look." "How can I fix this?" Christopher asked, raising his eyes to meet Margaret's. "How can I undo the pain I caused?" "Maybe you can't," Margaret said with the brutal honesty of someone who loved him too much to lie. "Maybe you've broken something that can't be repaired. But the least you can do is try." Christopher stood again, this time with determination instead of despair. "Michael, I want you to use every resource necessary. Hire every private investigator in the country if you have to. Find Grace." "I'm already doing that," Michael assured him. "And Veronica and Donovan?" Christopher asked, a new emotion creeping into his voice. Cold, calculated anger that promised devastating retribution. "What do you want to do about them?" Christopher walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he and Grace had shared so many precious moments. "I want them to pay for every tear they made Grace shed. I want them to understand that no one destroys my family and gets away with it." "Christopher," Margaret said softly, "revenge won't bring Grace back." "No," he agreed, turning to face her with eyes that blazed with a determination she hadn't seen in weeks. "But maybe, just maybe, if I can prove to her that I believe the truth now, that I'm willing to fight for our love, maybe she'll give me a second chance." "And if she doesn't?" Michael asked gently. Christopher went to the desk where the fake documents that had destroyed his life were still scattered. With a violent motion, he swept them all to the floor, watching them spread like the lies they truly were. "Then," he said, his voice loaded with iron determination, "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn her forgiveness. But first, I need to find her. I need to look into the eyes of the woman I love and beg for a chance to prove that the man who hurt her isn't really me." As Christopher finally began his journey toward redemption, hundreds of miles away, Grace sat in a small rented house in a town Christopher would never think to search, one hand on her growing belly, while silent tears streamed down her face. She didn't know that the truth had finally been discovered. She didn't know that the man who had destroyed her heart was now destroying himself with remorse. All she knew was that she was alone, carrying the child of a man who had chosen to believe the worst about her. And as the baby moved in her womb, she whispered promises that no matter what happened, she would protect this child from the pain that had devastated her own heart. The small town of Serenity Hollow nestled between the Blue Ridge Mountains like a well-kept secret. Its cobblestone streets and Victorian houses painted in pastel tones, creating a fairy tale atmosphere that contrasted dramatically with the anguish consuming Christopher Montgomery. 2 months of relentless searching had finally led to this moment. Margaret had discovered, through a network of contacts dating back to her own childhood in the countryside, that a pregnant young woman matching Grace's description had rented a small house on the outskirts of town. Christopher drove his Aston Martin through the narrow streets, his heart beating with a violence that threatened to crack his ribs. He had lost even more weight in recent weeks, his obsession with finding Grace consuming every thought, every breath. His reflection in the rearview mirror revealed a man transformed by pain and regret. Grown beard, eyes deeply marked by sleepless nights, a desperate intensity that would frighten strangers. The house Margaret had located was a simple wooden structure, painted light blue, with a small porch adorned by pots of wildflowers that Grace had clearly planted. A wooden swing moved gently in the afternoon breeze, and Christopher could imagine her sitting there, one hand on her growing belly, looking at the distant mountains, and perhaps, he prayed, thinking of him without the hatred he surely deserved. When Christopher got out of the car, his legs almost failed him. Months of corrosive regret and self-recrimination had culminated in this moment. The chance to look into the eyes of the woman he loved more than life and beg for forgiveness that might never come. He could see her through the kitchen window, moving slowly as she prepared something on the stove, and the sight of her pregnant silhouette almost brought him to his knees. Grace was more beautiful than he remembered, despite, or perhaps because of, the advanced pregnancy. Her chestnut hair was longer now, pulled back in a loose ponytail that revealed the elegant line of her neck. She wore a simple yellow cotton dress that gently embraced her rounded belly, and there was a serenity in her movements that Christopher couldn't decipher. Peace or resignation? He knocked on the door with trembling knuckles, each second of silence that followed stretching like an eternity. When Grace finally opened the door, the shock in her green eyes was like lightning striking his chest. "Christopher," she whispered, one hand automatically going to the doorframe as if she needed support. She was even more beautiful up close. Pregnancy had given her cheeks a rosy glow, her eyes seemed larger, more luminous, but there was also a guard in them that hadn't existed before, a careful protection he had placed there with his cruel words. "Grace," he said, his voice breaking just on her name. May I come in, please?" She hesitated, and Christopher could see the conflict passing across her face like clouds over the sun. Finally, she stepped away from the door, allowing him to enter the small but cozy house she had transformed into a home. The living room was simple but carefully decorated, with second-hand furniture she had clearly restored with love. There were books stacked on every surface, plants in every corner, and on the sofa a small baby blanket half-finished that made Christopher's heart contract painfully. "You're doing this alone," he observed, looking at the blanket, alternating pink and blue as if she wanted to be prepared for any possibility. "I have a lot of free time," Grace replied, sitting carefully in the armchair farthest from him. Even pregnant, she moved with a grace that made Christopher want to extend his arms and hold her, protect her, care for her the way he should have from the beginning. Christopher remained standing, feeling too large and out of place in the cozy room. "Grace, I need to tell you something. I need to explain." "You don't need to explain anything," she interrupted gently. "You made your position very clear the last time we talked. I was wrong." The words came out like a confession torn by force, completely, devastatingly wrong about everything. Grace studied his face, and Christopher could see she was fighting against something, hope, perhaps, or fear of being hurt again. "Wrong how?" Christopher knelt in front of her, ignoring the awkwardness of the position as he tried to get closer to her eye level. "The evidence was fake, Grace, all of it. Veronica and Richard Donovan created everything. The photographs, emails, recordings. It was all an elaborate lie to separate us." Grace caught her breath, her hands automatically going to her belly. "How did you find out?" "Michael hired investigators," Christopher explained, his voice gaining speed with urgency. Forensic experts who proved everything had been fabricated. The photographs were deepfakes, the emails were created with forgery software, the bank accounts didn't even exist. And you believed them, Grace said softly. You believed strangers instead of believing me. The simple accusation was like a knife to Christopher's heart. Yes, and that's something I'll carry for the rest of my life. Grace, I have no excuses, no justifications. I let my fears and insecurities destroy the only real and pure thing I ever had. Grace remained silent for a long moment, her hands tracing absent circles over her belly where their child, was growing. You questioned whether the baby was yours. Christopher closed his eyes, the memory of his own cruel words cutting him like glass. That was the worst thing I've ever said in my life. Grace, I know, I always knew, deep down, that this baby is mine, is ours. I was hurt and scared and you hurt me in a way I don't know if I can forgive, Grace finished, tears finally beginning to stream down her cheeks. Christopher, you didn't just question my fidelity. You questioned my character, my integrity, my ability to be a good mother to our child. I know, Christopher whispered, his own tears beginning to fall. I know, and if I could go back in time, if I could undo every cruel word I said. But you can't, Grace said, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. Some things once broken can't be repaired. Christopher felt as if she had just pronounced his death sentence. Grace, please. I know I don't deserve it. I know I have no right to ask, but could you give me a chance to prove I can be the man you deserve, the father our child deserves? Grace studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching for something in his face. Why now, Christopher? Why do you only believe the truth when it comes with scientific evidence? Why wasn't my word enough? The question hit him with the force of a tsunami, forcing him to confront the ugliest truth about himself. Because I'm a coward, he admitted, his voice breaking. Because it's easier to believe the worst in people than to risk being hurt. Because my father taught me that loving is being vulnerable, and vulnerability is weakness. And now? Grace asked softly. Now I know that true weakness is letting fear destroy love, Christopher said, looking directly into her eyes. Grace, these past months without you have been hell. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except how I had destroyed the only thing that made me feel alive. Grace placed a hand on her belly when the baby began to move, as if it could sense the tension in the room. The baby is due in 6 weeks. I want to be there, Christopher said immediately. I want to hold your hand. I want to be the first person our child sees when they come into the world. I want to be the father I promised to be before everything fell apart. And if I say no, Grace asked, if I say it's too late, that you lost your chance? Christopher felt like the world was crumbling around him, but forced himself to respond with the honesty he should have shown from the beginning. Then I'll respect your decision. But Grace, I'll never stop trying to prove I've changed. I'll never stop trying to earn a second chance. Grace remained silent for so long that Christopher began preparing for the rejection he knew he deserved. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low he had to lean in to hear. I still love you, she whispered. I hate myself for it, but I still love you, and our child deserves to have a father. Christopher felt like he could fly. Grace, but, she continued, raising a hand to stop him, love isn't enough. Trust needs to be rebuilt brick by brick. And Christopher, if you hurt me again, if you let your insecurities damage our family again, it will be the last time. Never again, Christopher promised, his voice loaded with conviction that came from the depths of his soul. Grace, I swear by everything that's sacred, I'll never again let anyone come between us. I'll never again doubt you or our love. Grace studied him for another moment before extending her hand. Then maybe we can try again. Slowly, carefully. Christopher took her hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world, bringing it to his lips to kiss it gently. Thank you, he whispered against her skin. Thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve. When the baby kicked vigorously, they both laughed through their tears. Christopher looked at Grace's belly with wonder and regret mixed together. May I? He asked hesitantly. Grace nodded, And when Christopher placed his large hand on her belly, feeling the strong movements of his child, he knew he would do anything, to protect this second chance he had been given. "Let's go home," Grace said softly. "Let's go home and try to be a family again." And for the first time in months, Christopher Montgomery smiled a true smile. The maternity hospital in Hartford was bathed in golden dawn light when Grace's first contractions began, 6 weeks after the reunion that had changed their lives forever. Christopher hadn't left her side for a moment since they returned to Connecticut, transforming the Montgomery mansion into a true home for the first time, filling it with laughter, soft music, and the kind of warmth that only genuine love can create. "Breathe with me, beautiful," Christopher whispered, holding Grace's hand as another contraction swept through her like a powerful wave. He had practiced breathing techniques with her for weeks, determined to be the birth partner she deserved. His hair was damp with nervous sweat and excitement, but his eyes never left her face, as if he could transfer his strength through his gaze. Grace squeezed his hand hard enough to leave marks, but instead of pain, Christopher felt only overwhelming gratitude for being there, for being forgiven, for witnessing the miracle they were about to share. "I'm okay," she panted, though they both knew she was far from okay. "The baby is... Oh God, Christopher, it's coming." "I'm here," he said, kissing her sweaty forehead. "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere, never again." The past 6 weeks had been a journey of delicate healing and careful reconstruction. Christopher had moved to the guest room, respecting Grace's space while they relearned to trust each other. He courted her again as if they were teenagers. Flowers every day, homemade dinners he cooked himself, with Margaret's secret help, long walks through the gardens where he told stories to the baby, and Grace laughed in that musical way that made his heart race. "Mrs. Montgomery," Dr. Patricia Wells said, entering the delivery room with the confident smile of someone who had helped bring thousands of lives into the world. "It's time. Let's meet this baby." What followed was an experience that transcended everything Christopher had imagined. Grace was magnificent, powerful and vulnerable at the same time, fighting to bring their child into the world with a courage that left him speechless. He whispered constant encouragement, wiped her face, held her hand like an anchor while she navigated the intense waves of labor. "I can see the head," Dr. Wells announced. "One more push, Grace. Your baby is almost here." Grace screamed, a primitive and powerful sound that echoed through the room, and then silence. A silence that lasted only seconds but seemed like an eternity to Christopher, until it was broken by the strong and indignant cry of a newborn. "It's a boy," Dr. Wells announced, lifting a small pink perfect creature who waved tiny fists in the air as if protesting his eviction from the cozy womb. Christopher felt tears explode from his eyes, tears of pure joy, relief, and love so intense he thought his heart might burst. "Grace," he whispered, his voice broken with emotion. "Look what you did. Look what we created." Grace was crying too, her arms extended to receive her son when Dr. Wells placed him on her chest. The baby was perfect, small but strong, with dark hair like Christopher's and what promised to be Grace's green eyes. "Hello, Lucas," Grace whispered, because they had chosen the name weeks ago during one of their evening walks. "Hello, my love. Mommy and Daddy are here." Christopher extended a trembling finger, which the baby immediately grasped with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Christopher murmured, amazed. "Absolutely perfect. Just like his parents," Dr. Wells commented with a smile. "I rarely see such a strong partnership in the delivery room. This baby is lucky." In the hours that followed, while Grace rested and Lucas slept in his arms, Christopher had time to reflect on the extraordinary journey that had led them to this moment. Less than a year ago, he had been an empty man, protected behind walls of cynicism and mistrust. Now, holding his son while watching the woman he loved more than life recover from the miracle she had just performed, he felt completely transformed. "Christopher," Grace said softly, extending her hand to him. "Come here." He sat carefully on the edge of the hospital bed, still holding Lucas against his chest. "How do you feel?" "Like I just ran a marathon," Grace laughed, but her laughter was pure and radiant. "But also, like I just performed the greatest miracle in the world." "You did," Christopher said, kissing her gently. Grace, I'll never be able to thank you enough for forgiving me this second chance, for bringing our son into the world." "Christopher," Grace interrupted gently, placing a finger on his lips. "Stop blaming yourself. We were hurt, but we healed. We were broken, but we rebuilt ourselves. And now we have this." She gestured to Lucas, who had opened his small eyes and was looking between them with the serious expression of someone trying to understand this strange new world. "He has your eyes," Grace observed. "And your mouth," Christopher countered. "And hopefully your kindness, your strength, your ability to forgive." "And your intelligence," Grace completed. "Your determination, your ability to protect the people you love." They remained silent for a moment, lost in contemplation of their son. Then Christopher spoke, his voice loaded with a solemnity that transformed his words into a sacred promise. "Lucas Montgomery," he said, looking directly into the baby's eyes, "I promise you'll grow up knowing you're loved. I promise I'll never question whether you're wanted, never doubt your worth, never make you pay for your father's mistakes. You'll have what I never had, parents who truly love each other and put family above everything." Grace felt fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. "And I promise," she added, "that you'll grow up in a house full of honesty, where problems are solved with communication, where love isn't conditional, and where you'll always know you have a safe place to come home to." As if understanding the magnitude of the promises being made, Lucas made a small, satisfied sound and closed his eyes again, trusting completely in the arms that held him. 3 days later, when they brought Lucas home for the first time, the Montgomery mansion had been transformed. Margaret had decorated everything with blue ribbons and balloons, and the flowers filling every room created an atmosphere of celebration the house had never known. So even Harold Montgomery, the cold patriarch who rarely showed emotion, held his grandson with something approaching tenderness. "He'll be a strong Montgomery," Harold declared, but when he looked at Grace, his expression softened. "And he'll have his mother's kindness, a powerful combination." It was the closest thing to an apology Harold Montgomery was capable of, and Grace accepted it with characteristic grace. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Veronica Kingsley and Richard Donovan faced the consequences of their cruel conspiracy. Michael's investigators had collected enough evidence to destroy their reputations and careers, and criminal proceedings for forgery and defamation were underway. New York high society, which had once courted them, now avoided them like pariahs. But Christopher barely thought of them now. His thirst for revenge had evaporated the moment he held his son, replaced by something much more powerful: gratitude for the family he had almost lost, and determination to protect it with his life. That first night at home, Christopher and Grace sat in the nursery he had personally decorated, watching Lucas sleep in his crib. The full moon shone through the window, the same moon that had witnessed their first kiss on the balcony so many months ago. "Do you regret it?" Christopher asked softly. "Giving me a second chance." Grace turned to look at him, and in the smile that lit up her face, Christopher saw his entire future. "Never," she said. "We were forged in fire, Christopher. Our love was tested in ways few couples face, and we survived. More than that, we thrived." Christopher pulled her into his arms, kissing the top of her head as they watched their son sleep. "I love you, Grace Montgomery. I love you beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond anything I ever thought possible. And I love you too," Grace whispered against his chest, "despite everything, because of everything, forever." From the crib came a small, satisfied sigh, as if Lucas approved of the promises of love filling his new world. And in the house that had once been a cold mausoleum of privilege and isolation, a true family had finally been born, not from the ashes of convenience and obligation, but from the purifying fire of forgiveness and the transforming power of true love. Christopher Montgomery had begun as a broken man, Grace as a desperate woman, and both as strangers trapped in a marriage neither had chosen. But through pain, loss, betrayal, and redemption, they had found something more precious than any fortune: a love that could survive any storm, and a family built on the unshakable foundation of trust earned through fire. And as night covered Connecticut like a soft blanket, 3 hearts beat in unison, in a symphony of love that would echo through future generations of the Montgomery family. A family that had learned that true love isn't a fairy tale, but something much more powerful, A conscious choice renewed each day to fight for what matters more than anything in the world. Christopher and Grace proved that even the most wounded hearts can be healed when they find true love. They discovered that sometimes you must lose everything to understand the value of what truly matters. Their scars became the foundation of an unbreakable strength, and their pain transformed into the wisdom necessary to build a family based on absolute trust and transformative forgiveness. Little Lucas will grow up knowing he was born from a love that survived the fire of betrayal and emerged purer, stronger, deeper. Because in the end, they discovered that true love isn't the absence of problems, but the courageous choice to fight together against any storm that dares threaten their happiness. And perhaps deep down, this story also speaks of us and our infinite capacity to be reborn when we choose to love without fear. If this story touched your heart and sparked your imagination, subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if every moment was worth it, drop a totally worth it.